They mocked him for using iron sights. Soviet officers looked at intelligence reports describing a Finnish sniper operating without a telescopic scope and laughed. No magnification, no modern optics, just basic iron sights, equipment they considered primitive, outdated, inadequate. One commander wrote in a report, "A sniper without a scope is not a threat. He is a nuisance." That dismissal was a fatal mistake, because on January 22, 1940, in the frozen forests of eastern Finland, that nuisance killed over 40 Soviet soldiers in a single day. 40 men, one rifle, iron sights. By nightfall, an entire sector had ceased operations, not because of overwhelming force, but because soldiers refused to move. The forest had become psychologically impassable. This is the story of how mockery turned into massacre, how technological superiority meant nothing against perfect execution, how one man with outdated equipment proved that in war, the most dangerous weapon isn't the one that looks advanced. It's the one that actually works. December 1939, Eastern Finland. When the Soviet Union invaded Finland, confidence was absolute. The Red Army was massive, hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of tanks, artillery measured by the thousands, aircraft dominating the skies. Finland's entire military was smaller than some Soviet army groups. Victory was assumed. The only question was how quickly it would come. Then the forests changed everything. Soviet columns stretched thin through terrain they didn't understand. Temperatures plunged to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Equipment failed. Movement became predictable. And men started dying. At first, the losses were dismissed. A soldier would fall during patrol. Another would collapse while standing guard. Officers assumed accidents, frostbite, exhaustion, confusion, and the brutal cold. But intelligence reports began noting something unusual. The kills were clean, precise, single shots, always fatal. And when search teams investigated, they found no trace of the shooter. By late December, counterintelligence officers compiled patterns. A sniper was operating in the sector, probably Finnish, probably local to the area. But one detail in the reports drew particular attention and ridicule. The sniper appeared to be using iron sights, no telescopic scope. Among Soviet officers, this was almost laughable. By 1939, telescopic sights were standard equipment for sniper operations. Magnification allowed engagement at extended ranges. Optics provided clarity in poor visibility. Scopes represented technological advancement, science, precision, modernity. Iron sights, by comparison, were seen as relics. Adequate for basic riflemen, perhaps, but for specialized sniper work, primitive. A limitation that any competent marksman would eliminate immediately. Major Alexei Volkov, in a report dated December 28, wrote, "Intelligence suggests the enemy sniper is not equipped with optics. This indicates either poor supply conditions or inadequate training. Regardless, effective range will be severely limited. Counter-sniper operations should encounter minimal difficulty." This assessment was shared by most Soviet commanders. The mockery wasn't malicious, it was confident. They genuinely believed that a sniper without a scope couldn't pose a serious threat. That confidence shaped their tactical response. Instead of treating the sniper as a critical threat, they categorized him as a manageable problem. Movement continued through contested areas. Patrols maintained standard procedures. Units were told to be alert, but not to let isolated losses disrupt momentum. The strategy was simple: push through with overwhelming numbers. A single sniper, especially one using inferior equipment, couldn't stop an army. This logic seemed sound. Until January. By early January 1940, casualty reports from the sector began showing a disturbing pattern. Losses weren't decreasing. They were accelerating. Officers were being killed at higher rates than enlisted men. Radio operators, messengers, anyone whose death disrupted command and control. The targeting wasn't random, it was selective, strategic. Counter-sniper teams, were finally deployed with serious intent. These were experienced men, equipped with modern scope rifles, trained in tracking and elimination procedures. Their orders were clear: locate the shooter, verify his position, eliminate him. They failed. Search teams found firing positions, but always after the sniper had left. They found spent cartridges, but never fresh enough to track immediately. They found evidence of his presence, but never the man himself. And the kills continued. What frustrated Soviet officers most was the apparent impossibility of the situation. How could a sniper without magnification achieve such consistent results? How could he engage at ranges that should require optics? The answer was simpler than they realized, and far more dangerous. The Finnish sniper wasn't trying to compete at extended ranges. He was operating at distances where iron sights were perfectly adequate, and where his lack of optical equipment gave him critical advantages. No glass to reflect light and reveal position. No scope to fog in extreme cold. No magnification to narrow field of view. He could stay lower to the ground. His rifle profile was minimal. His movements were harder to detect. But Soviet commanders didn't understand this yet. They were still mocking the iron sights. And that mockery was about to become a massacre. By mid-January, the mockery had stopped. Not officially. Reports still referred to the sniper's limited equipment and restricted capability. But the men on the ground had stopped laughing, because the pattern was undeniable. Soldiers died in the same sectors. Officers fell while issuing orders. Messengers collapsed while moving between units. The kills were consistent, precise, and impossible to predict. Counter-sniper teams reported the same frustration. They could react to shots, but never fast enough. They could estimate distance, but never locate position. They could search areas thoroughly and find nothing. The sniper moved like smoke, present, then gone, leaving only bodies behind. Private Dmitry Sokolov, in a letter home dated January 15th, wrote, "They told us the Finnish sniper has no scope. They said he was not dangerous. They were wrong. Yesterday, 3 men from my unit died. No one heard the shots until impact. No one saw where they came from. The officers say we must continue advancing. But the men are afraid. We do not fear battle. We fear the forest." Soviet tactical doctrine had no effective answer. Standard counter-sniper procedures required identifying firing positions, then suppressing them with overwhelming firepower. But the Finnish sniper never stayed in one position long enough for suppression to matter. Artillery was used to saturate suspected areas. Shells rained down on likely firing points. Trees splintered. Snow exploded. But when infantry advanced to clear the zones, they found nothing. The sniper had already moved, or had never been there. Aircraft conducted reconnaissance, scanning forests for disturbed snow, for tracks, for any sign of human presence. Pilots reported nothing useful. White camouflage against white snow made visual detection nearly impossible from altitude. The forest was denying them every advantage. Meanwhile, the kills continued to accumulate, not in dramatic bursts. That would have been easier to process, but steadily, relentlessly, day after day. Officers began comparing notes across units. Patterns emerged. The sniper fired most frequently during movement transitions, when units were shifting from advance to halt, when formations were adjusting, when attention naturally dropped. These were moments measured in seconds, but the sniper exploited them perfectly. He also targeted predictable behaviors. Soldiers who paused in the same locations to rest. Officers who stood while issuing orders. Men who moved without checking their surroundings first. This wasn't random shooting. This was behavioral analysis. He was studying them, learning their habits, their patterns, their mistakes. And he was punishing those mistakes with surgical precision. Captain Mikhail Petrov, in a report dated January 18th, wrote, "The enemy sniper demonstrates tactical awareness that exceeds expectations. He does not engage randomly. He waits for vulnerability. He selects targets that maximize disruption. He withdraws before response can be coordinated. Our countermeasures have proven ineffective. Morale is deteriorating rapidly. But Soviet command still believed the problem could be solved with pressure. Orders came down. Increase movement frequency. Rotate routes. Vary timing. Force the sniper to react. Then overwhelm his position. This strategy would reach its test on January 22, 1940, and it would fail catastrophically. January 22, 1940, Eastern Finland. The day began with clear skies and stable temperatures, by winter standards. Minus 30 degrees Celsius. Light snowfall. Visibility adequate for operations. Soviet command ordered increased movement through a critical forest corridor. Multiple units were scheduled to pass through the same compressed route. Supply columns, infantry reinforcements, command elements. The goal was momentum. Push through. Maintain pressure. Don't let isolated losses slow the advance. Somewhere in that frozen forest, Simo Häyhä, the 33-year-old Finnish farmer they'd mocked for using iron sights, was already in position. He had arrived hours before dawn, moving through darkness when Soviet forces were least active. He selected terrain carefully. Good sight lines over the corridor, natural concealment, multiple escape routes. Then he waited. As light grew, movement began. The first Soviet unit entered the corridor, an infantry patrol, moving cautiously but predictably. They followed the same compressed path that terrain naturally created. Snow forced them into a narrow route. Trees limited lateral movement. Häyhä observed. He counted soldiers. He noted spacing. He identified the patrol leader. Then he waited longer. Patience was everything. At 8:47, according to later reconstructions based on unit logs, the first shot was fired. A Soviet officer, a lieutenant issuing orders to his men, collapsed mid-sentence. The impact was clean. Fatal. Immediate. The patrol reacted with confusion. They scattered, seeking cover, trying to determine where the shot originated. Some fired randomly into trees. Others shouted for medics. But Häyhä didn't fire again. Not yet. He watched how they moved, where they looked, how long before discipline returned. An hour later, another unit entered the same corridor. They'd been warned about the earlier incident, but movement had to continue. Orders from above. Momentum was priority. Häyhä fired again. Another body in the snow. This time, the response was faster, more coordinated. Return fire came quickly, but it struck nothing. The sniper had already shifted position, moving meters to the side, changing angle slightly. Throughout the morning, the pattern repeated. Soviet units moved through the corridor. Häyhä fired. Men died. Response teams rushed in. They found nothing. By midday, the casualty count was alarming. Over a dozen dead. All in the same sector. All from single, precise shots. All without the shooter being located. Soviet commanders faced a decision. Halt movement or continue advancing. They chose to continue. Stopping would acknowledge defeat. It would mean one Finnish sniper with iron sights had successfully blocked a major supply route. That was unacceptable. More units were pushed into the corridor. Patrols increased. Blocking elements were positioned to cut off escape routes if the sniper revealed himself. Häyhä watched this escalation with understanding. They were creating density, and density created opportunity. He fired throughout the afternoon, not rapidly, but methodically. One shot, then observation, then another when conditions aligned. Each kill was deliberate. Officers, radio operators, anyone whose death would create maximum disruption. By late afternoon, something unprecedented happened. Soviet units in the corridor began refusing orders. Not openly, not with direct insubordination, but movement slowed to a crawl. Men took longer to advance. They paused more frequently. They found reasons to delay. Fear had become tactical paralysis. One sergeant, in a report filed that evening, wrote, "My men will not advance through the forest corridor. They believe the sniper sees everything. They believe moving is death. I cannot force them forward. Discipline has collapsed." By nightfall, The count was undeniable. Over 40 Soviet soldiers had died in that single sector in one day. Not from artillery, not from mass combat, from one man with iron sights, firing from positions they could never identify, withdrawing through routes they could never block. The forest corridor, a critical supply route, was now effectively closed. Not because Finnish forces held it in strength, but because Soviet soldiers refused to enter it. Simo Häyhä had achieved something unprecedented in modern warfare. He had made terrain psychologically impassable through precision alone, and he'd done it with equipment Soviet officers had mocked as primitive. The irony was devastating, because while they'd been confident in their technological superiority, Häyhä had understood something fundamental. In extreme cold, iron sights don't fog. They don't reflect light. They don't narrow your field of view. They don't add weight or profile to your rifle. They just work. And that night, as Soviet commanders compiled casualty reports and tried to explain how 40 men died in one sector in one day, they finally understood. They weren't fighting inadequate equipment. They were fighting perfect execution. The aftermath of January 22nd changed everything. Soviet command could no longer dismiss the Finnish sniper as a limited threat. The numbers were too extreme. The tactical impact too severe. An entire sector had been rendered inoperable by one man. Orders came down. Find him. Eliminate him. Use any resources necessary. Counter-sniper operations intensified. Artillery saturation became standard procedure before any movement. Aircraft were deployed constantly. Entire companies were tasked exclusively with hunting one soldier. But Simo Häyhä had already adapted. After January 22nd, he reduced his operational tempo. He fired less frequently. He allowed days to pass without engagement. He understood that his success had brought maximum attention, and that continuing at the same pace would eventually lead to mistakes. Patience had always been his weapon. Now it became his shield. But Soviet forces had learned something too. They began moving unpredictably. They staggered timing. They used decoys. They repositioned faster. The duel entered its most dangerous phase. Throughout February, engagements continued, but differently. Häyhä fired only when conditions overwhelmingly favored survival. Escape routes planned before firing. Terrain selected for confusion potential. Targets chosen for maximum strategic disruption rather than opportunity. Soviet casualties continued to climb. Not rapidly, but relentlessly. By early March, Häyhä's confirmed kill count had reached numbers that seemed impossible to verify. Over 500 Soviet soldiers, in approximately 100 days of operations, using iron sights. Then came March 6, 1940. During one engagement, Soviet forces deployed the most coordinated response yet. Artillery pre-registered, blocking elements positioned, aircraft on standby. The net was tighter than it had ever been. Häyhä selected a target, a Soviet officer moving with deliberate exposure. He recognized the trap, but the target was too valuable. He fired. The response was instantaneous and overwhelming. Artillery shells began falling within seconds. Machine gun fire raked the area. Rifle shots converged from multiple directions. Then an explosive round, likely fragmentation ammunition, detonated near his position. The blast threw him sideways. He was hit. The damage was catastrophic. His face was shattered. Blood pooled in snow. He lost consciousness. Finnish forces recovered him hours later. Medics assumed he wouldn't survive transport. He remained in a coma for 6 days. On March 13, 1940, the Winter War officially ended. Armistice was signed. The fighting stopped. Simo Häyhä woke on March 19th. When he was finally able to communicate, Finnish military officials compiled the final numbers. According to verified records, confirmed through unit logs and officer reports, Simo Häyhä had achieved between 505 and 542 confirmed kills during the Winter War, the highest sniper tally in military history. And he'd done it with iron sights that Soviet officers had mocked as primitive equipment. The story of January 22nd became legendary, not because of the numbers alone, but because of what it represented. Soviet forces had entered Finland with overwhelming technological superiority. They had scopes, artillery, aircraft, tanks, numerical advantage. They had everything modern warfare said should guarantee victory. But they'd faced a 33-year-old farmer who understood something they didn't. Technology means nothing if it doesn't match conditions. Telescopic sights fog and extreme cold. Glass reflects light. Magnification narrows field of view. Modern equipment fails when temperatures drop to -40. Iron sights don't fog. They don't reflect. They don't narrow vision. They don't fail. They just work. Simo Häyhä had turned supposed technological inferiority into tactical superiority. He'd made his limitation his greatest advantage. And 40 men died in one day because Soviet officers had been too confident to understand that. Häyhä survived his catastrophic wound. He recovered slowly, his face permanently disfigured. He returned to farming after the war. He lived quietly for decades, avoiding attention, rarely discussing what happened in those forests. When asked, late in life, what he felt about being mocked for using iron sights, his response was characteristically simple. I used what worked. No bitterness, no pride, just fact. He lived to 96 years old, dying peacefully in 2002. His record, 505 to 542 confirmed kills, has never been broken. Modern militaries still study January 22, 1940, not because of the kill count, but because of the lesson. The most dangerous opponent isn't the one with the best equipment. It's the one who understands that equipment is only as good as its application. Soviet officers mocked iron sights. They saw them as primitive, inadequate, a limitation. Simo Häyhä saw them as perfect for the conditions he operated in. And by the time Soviet command understood the difference, over 500 of their soldiers were dead. The mockery had become a massacre. And the lesson, that technological superiority means nothing without tactical understanding, remains unteachable, because it requires humility to learn. And in January 1940, confidence killed more Soviet soldiers than any Finnish bullet ever could.